Colt Avery never expected to find a bride in a wedding dress running through the rain on his ranch. For 10 years, the 58-year-old cattleman had lived alone, his heart buried with his wife. When he stops a runaway buckboard and finds 21-year-old Lila Grace McKenna inside, torn dress and tearful eyes, he learns she's fleeing a stepmother who sold her to a gambling man. Colt offers her shelter, thinking he's just helping a desperate girl get to safety. But as summer passes, Lila begins healing more than herself. She mends curtains, sings to orphaned calves, and slowly brings life back to the lonely ranch. Her gentle spirit reminds Colt of the man he used to be, while his kindness shows her what real family looks like. But when her past catches up to them, will their newfound happiness survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a sky, so wide it seemed to swallow the earth whole. Colt Avery stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and rose. At 58, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd built something lasting from dust and determination. The Amber Creek Ranch spread across 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, home to the finest cattle herd in 3 counties. Yet for all its success, the ranch felt hollow as an abandoned church. Colt's weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air. The liquid had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. These dawn vigils had become rituals since Sarah's passing 10 years back, moments when memory felt more real than the present, when her laughter seemed to echo from the kitchen windows behind him. The bunkhouse stirred to life as his ranch hands began their day. Jake Morrison, his foreman, emerged first, a man of 45 with graying temples and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought. Behind him came Tom Bradley and Pete Kellerman, younger men who'd learned their trade under Colt's patient guidance. They moved with the easy efficiency of men who knew their work and trusted their boss. "Morning, Colt," Jake called, touching the brim of his hat. "Cattle in the south pasture need checking. Tom spotted a few strays yesterday." Colt nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Take Pete with you. I'll ride the north fence line." It was the same conversation they'd had hundreds of times, comfortable in its predictability. Work was the anchor that kept Colt from drifting too far into the past. The ranch demanded attention, decisions, leadership, things that pulled him back to the present when grief threatened to claim him entirely. The house behind him stood as testament to dreams once shared. Sarah had sketched every room, chosen every board, painted every wall with her own hands. The kitchen still held her herbs in mason jars, their labels written in her careful script. Her sewing basket sat beside the parlor window, needle and thread, waiting for hands that would never return. Colt had tried, in those first dark months, to pack away her belongings, but touching her things felt like erasure, and he couldn't bear to make her disappear twice. So the house remained a shrine to vanished happiness, beautiful and empty as a song without words. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the road. Doc Henderson approached on his bay mare, medical bag secured behind his saddle. The old physician had been making these weekly visits since Sarah's funeral, claiming to check on Colt's health, but really offering companionship to a man who'd forgotten how to seek it. "You're up early, even for you," Doc said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man past 70. "Couldn't sleep." Colt finally took a sip of the cold coffee and grimaced. "Storms coming in from the west." Doc squinted at the clear sky. "Don't see any clouds." "They're there." Colt had learned to read the territory's moods, the way the wind shifted, how the cattle bunched together, the particular quality of light that meant weather was building beyond the mountains. "Be here by nightfall." They stood in companionable silence, 2 men who'd seen enough of life to understand that some truths didn't need speaking. Doc had delivered Sarah's diagnosis, sat with Colt through her final days, helped dig her grave when the ground was too frozen for the church gravediggers. He'd earned the right to visit without invitation. "Martha's making extra bread this week," Doc said eventually. Thought you might like a loaf." Colt almost smiled. Martha Henderson had been trying to feed him properly for a decade, as if love could be measured in biscuits and jam. "Tell her I'm grateful. Tell her yourself. Come to Sunday dinner." The invitation hung between them like a challenge. Colt had avoided social gatherings since Sarah's death, claiming work demands but really unable to bear the weight of other people's pity. Their happiness felt intrusive, their attempts at comfort like salt in an open wound. "Maybe next week," he said, knowing he'd find another excuse. Doc nodded as if he believed it. "The offer stands." After the physician left, Colt saddled his horse and rode toward the north pasture. The bay gelding, Thunder, had been Sarah's favoriteur, gentle giant, with intelligent eyes and a smooth gait. She'd named him for his midnight black coat and the way he announced his arrival with deep, rumbling nickels. The fence lines stretched for miles, posts and wire marking the boundary between Colt's land and the open range. He'd built most of it himself in the early years, Sarah riding beside him with lunch, packed in saddlebags and dreams, mapped out in conversation. She'd wanted children to fill the house with noise and laughter. He'd wanted to give her everything her heart desired. But children hadn't come, and eventually they'd stopped talking about it. The silence had grown comfortable, two people learning to find completeness in each other instead of in the family they'd planned. Then the fever took her, swift and merciless, leaving Colt to face the truth that love doesn't guarantee permanence. The storm he'd predicted began building as afternoon faded to evening. Clouds gathered like dark wool, rolling across the sky with the slow certainty of judgment. Wind picked up, bending grass and rattling windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, still hours away but coming steadily closer. Colt finished his evening chores and retreated to the house. The kitchen felt too large for one man, the dining table too long for a single-place setting. He'd grown accustomed to eating, standing at the counter, reading week-old newspapers and listening to the house settle around him. The storm arrived with the darkness, rain hammering against the windows and wind howling through the eaves. Colt sat in his chair by the fireplace, Sarah's chair empty beside him, and tried to read by lamplight. But the words kept blurring, his mind wandering to memories of other storms when Sarah would make hot chocolate and they'd sit together, watching nature's fury from the safety of home. A sound cut through the storm, not thunder, but something else. Colt set down his book and listened. There it was again. The crash of wood against wood, the screech of metal on metal. A wagon in distress, somewhere close to the house. He grabbed his coat and hat, lit a lantern, and stepped into the storm. Rain immediately soaked through his clothes, cold fingers of wind cutting through fabric and flesh alike. The sound came from the main road, where a buckboard had overturned in the muddy ditch. Colt approached carefully, lantern held high. The wagon lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the wind. A horse thrashed in the traces, wild with fear and pain. And huddled beside the wreckage, barely visible in the storm, was a figure in white. "Hello there," Colt called, fighting to be heard over the wind. "Are you hurt?" The figure looked up, and Colt's breath caught. It was a young woman, maybe 20, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that reflected his lantern light like pools of spring water. She wore a wedding dress, once white but now torn and stained with mud and rain. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible, "I need help." Colt's first instinct was to step back, to return to his safe solitude and pretend he'd never seen her. But something in her eyes, a desperate hope mixed with bone-deep terror, made him move forward instead. "Can you stand?" he asked, extending his hand. She took it, fingers ice-cold and trembling. "I think so." Together they struggled to their feet, the woman leaning heavily on Colt's arm. He could see she was injured, a cut on her forehead, bruises on her arms, and the way she favored her left leg suggested more damage hidden beneath the ruined dress. "My horse," she said, looking toward the trapped animal. Colt examined the traces with practiced eyes. The horse had a gash on its flank, but nothing life-threatening. With careful work, he freed the frightened animal and led it toward the barn, the woman following on unsteady legs. Inside the barn, Sheltered from the storm, Colt lit another lantern and got his first clear look at his unexpected guest. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 21, at most, with delicate features and intelligent eyes that held too much knowledge for her years. The wedding dress told a story he didn't want to hear. "What's your name?" he asked, tending to her horse's wound. "Lila Grace McKenna," she replied, then added quickly, "And before you ask, I'm not running from a husband. I'm running from becoming one man's property." The bitterness in her voice made Colt look up sharply. "Someone hurt you?" It wasn't a question. He'd seen enough of life to recognize the signs, the way she held herself, the quick glances toward the door, the tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with cold. "My stepmother," Lila said, wrapping her arms around herself. "She sold me to pay her gambling debts. The wedding was supposed to be tonight." Colt's jaw tightened. He'd known such arrangements existed, but hearing it spoken aloud in his own barn, seeing the evidence in this girl's torn dress and frightened eyes, made his stomach clench with anger. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I don't know." The admission seemed to cost her. "I have cousins in California, but that's 2,000 miles away. I have no money, no horse of my own." She looked around the barn, taking in the well-maintained stalls and quality tack. "I don't suppose you need help with anything?" "I can cook, clean, tend animals. I learn quickly." Colt studied her face in the lamplight. Common sense told him to give her a meal and directions to the nearest town. Getting involved in other people's troubles was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially not with a young woman who looked at him with such desperate hope. But something about her reminded him of Sarah, not her appearance, but her spirit. The way she held her chin up despite her circumstances, the quiet dignity that survived even her desperate flight. Sarah had possessed that same inner strength, that refusal to be broken by life's cruelties. "The bunkhouse has an empty room," he heard himself say. "You can stay there tonight, get warm and dry. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Relief flooded Lila's face, followed immediately by gratitude so profound it made Colt uncomfortable. "Thank you. I promise I won't be any trouble." But as he led her toward the bunkhouse, Colt had the uncomfortable feeling that trouble had already found him. In the space of an hour, his carefully ordered world had been invaded by a girl in a wedding dress, and he suspected nothing would ever be quite the same again. The locket in his pocket, Sarah's locket, which he'd carried every day since her death, felt suddenly heavy against his chest. For 10 years, it had been his anchor to the past, his excuse for avoiding the future. Now, watching Lila Grace McKenna disappear into the guest room, he wondered if anchors could become chains. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the bunkhouse, something had shifted. The first crack had appeared in the wall Colt had built around his heart, and he wasn't sure whether to be terrified or grateful. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Lila Grace had settled into the ranch's rhythm with surprising ease. She'd mended her wedding dress as best she could and borrowed one of Sarah's old work dresses from the trunk Colt kept in the main house. The simple blue cotton fit her well enough, though it hung loose in places where Sarah had been fuller. Colt watched her from the kitchen window as she fed the chickens, humming a tune he didn't recognize. She moved with natural grace, speaking softly to the birds as if they were old friends. In just 3 days, she'd brought more life to the ranch than he'd seen in 10 years. "She's got away with animals," Jake observed, joining Colt at the window. "Yesterday I saw her gentle that ornery stallion in the south paddock. He was eating sugar cubes right from her hand." Colt nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd noticed the same thing, how the cattle calmed when she approached, how the barn cats followed her around like devoted disciples. Even Thunder had taken to nickering whenever she appeared. "You thinking of keeping her on permanent?" Jake asked carefully. The question hung in the air like smoke. Colt had been avoiding it for 3 days, telling himself he was just being neighborly, helping a woman in distress until she could figure out her next move. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. He didn't want her to leave. "She's got nowhere else to go," Colt said finally. "That's not what I asked." Before Colt could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. A small group of riders appeared through the morning haze, 5 men, led by a woman on a black mare. Even at a distance, Colt could see the authority in the woman's bearing, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Company," Jake muttered. Colt stepped onto the porch, Jake beside him. The riders approached at a measured pace, neither hurried nor casual. As they drew closer, Colt could make out details. The woman was perhaps 50, well-dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of money and status. Her face was sharp-featured and calculating, with eyes like chips of flint. The men with her were a mixed lot who wore badges that caught the morning sun, while the others had the hard look of men paid to intimidate rather than protect. Colt's hand instinctively moved toward the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. The woman dismounted with practiced ease, her gaze sweeping across the ranch buildings with obvious assessment. When her eyes settled on Colt, her smile was as cold as winter wind. "Mr. Avery, I presume." Her voice carried the cultured accent of Eastern education, mixed with Western authority. "I'm Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Colt's jaw tightened. He'd known this moment would come, had hoped they'd have more time to prepare. "Can't say I do, ma'am." Mrs. Hawthorne's smile sharpened. "Perhaps I should be more specific. 3 nights ago, my stepdaughter fled from her wedding ceremony. She was seen heading this direction in a stolen buckboard. I have reason to believe she's here. And if she is, then I'll be taking her home." Mrs. Hawthorne reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a folded document. "This is a legal marriage contract, signed and witnessed. Lila Grace McKenna is bound by law to marry Mr. Garrett Simpson. By harboring her, you're interfering with a legal arrangement." Colt took the document, his eyes scanning the formal language. It looked official enough: signatures, seals, the kind of legal terminology that carried weight in territorial courts. But something about it felt wrong, too convenient, too perfectly crafted. "Marriage contracts can be challenged," he said carefully. "Not this one." One of the badge wearing men stepped forward. Sheriff Dalton from Carbon County, a man Colt knew by reputation, if not personally. "Mr. Simpson has filed charges for theft of property and breach of contract. Miss McKenna needs to come with us." "Property?" Jake's voice carried disbelief and anger. "She's not a piece of livestock. She's an unmarried woman under 21. Mrs. Hawthorne replied smoothly. "Under territorial law, her legal guardian, which would be May, has the right to arrange her marriage. The contract is binding." Colt felt the familiar weight of Sarah's locket against his chest, a reminder of promises made and kept. But looking at the cold calculation in Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes, he thought of different promises, the kind that protected the innocent from those who would use law as a weapon. "I'd like to see this contract examined by a territorial judge," he said. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression hardened. "That would take weeks, Mr. Avery. Are you prepared to house and feed a fugitive for that long? Are you willing to face charges yourself for harboring stolen property?" "She's not stolen property," Colt said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd fought for everything he owned. "She's a human being with the right to choose her own path." "Pretty words," said one of the hired men, a scarred brute with mean eyes. "But the law's the law." At that moment, Lila appeared around the corner of the house, a basket of eggs in her hands. She stopped short when she saw the visitors, her face going pale as parchment. The basket slipped from her fingers, eggs shattering on the ground in splashes of yellow and white. "Hello, Lila dear," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "Time to come home." "I won't go back," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't marry that man. Mr. Simpson is a successful businessman with property and prospects. You should be grateful for such an advantageous match." "He's a drunk and a gambler who beats his horses," Lila shot back, finding her courage. "I've seen how he treats things he owns." Mrs. Hawthorne's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the venom beneath. "You ungrateful little wretch, after everything I've done for you, you sold me." Lila's voice rose, years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. You gambled away my father's money and then sold me to pay your debts. That's not guardianship, it's slavery. Enough. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, hand resting on his gun. Miss McKenna, you're coming with us. Mr. Avery, step aside. Colt moved to place himself between Lila and the sheriff. I don't think so. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake moved to flank Colt, his own hand near his weapon. From the bunkhouse, Tom and Pete emerged, drawn by the raised voices and sensing trouble. Mr. Avery, Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice now carrying a thread of steel. You're making a serious mistake. I have the law on my side, and men willing to enforce it. Don't throw your life away over a girl who's nothing to you. But that was where she was wrong. In 3 days, Lila had become something to him, a reminder that life could hold more than mere survival, that healing was possible even for hearts that had been buried with the dead. She'd brought laughter back to his ranch, had made him remember what it felt like to protect something precious. She's under my protection, Colt said quietly, and she'll stay under my protection until a territorial judge can review this contract properly. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes glittered with malice. Very well, Mr. Avery, but understand this, I have resources you can't imagine and patience you shouldn't test. This isn't over. She remounted her horse with sharp, angry movements. Sheriff Dalton, I'll expect you to file the proper charges. Mr. Avery is now harboring a fugitive and interfering with legal proceedings. Sheriff Dalton looked uncomfortable but nodded. I'll file the paperwork, but it'll take time to process. Territory's got bigger problems than marriage contracts right now. Then we'll handle this ourselves, one of the hired men growled. No, Mrs. Hawthorne said sharply. We'll let the law take its course. But Mr. Avery should know that the law has a long reach and longer memory. As the group rode away, Colt felt the weight of what he'd just done settle on his shoulders. He'd made enemies of powerful people, had painted a target on his ranch and everyone in it. But looking at Lila's face, the gratitude mixed with terror, the hope struggling against despair, he knew he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. Thank you, Lila whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know what this could cost you. Colt reached out without thinking, his weathered hand gently touching her shoulder. Some things are worth the cost. But as he watched the dust cloud disappear down the road, he wondered if he'd just signed all their death warrants. Mrs. Hawthorne's parting words echoed in his mind. This wasn't over. He'd faced down rustlers, outlaws, and claimed jumpers in his time, but something about the cold calculation in that woman's eyes told him this fight would be different. This time, he wasn't just protecting property or livestock. He was protecting something infinitely more precious and infinitely more fragile, a young woman's right to choose her own destiny, and perhaps his own chance at redemption. The marriage contract in his hand felt heavier than any legal document should. Tomorrow, he'd ride to town and find a lawyer, someone who could challenge its validity. But tonight, he'd stand guard and pray that morning would bring answers instead of more trouble. In his pocket, Sarah's locket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if his late wife were offering her blessing from beyond the grave. For the first time in 10 years, Colt Avery was fighting for something other than mere survivorland. It felt like coming back to life. The week following Mrs. Hawthorne's visit passed with deceptive quiet. Colt had ridden to Cheyenne to consult with Ezra Morrison, the best lawyer within 200 miles, and had returned with mixed news. The marriage contract was legal in form, but Morrison believed it could be challenged on grounds of coercion and fraud if they could prove Mrs. Hawthorne had used deception to gain guardianship rights. The burden of proof will be on us, Morrison had explained, his weathered face grave beneath wire-rimmed spectacles. Territory courts don't like to overturn contracts, especially when money's involved. But if the girl was coerced, if there's evidence of fraud in the arrangement, we might have a case. Evidence. That was the rub. Lila's word against Mrs. Hawthorne's, and the stepmother clearly had resources and connections that could make life difficult for anyone who opposed her. But in the meantime, life on the ranch had taken on an unexpected rhythm. Lila had thrown herself into work with the determination of someone proving her worth, and Colt found himself looking forward to each day in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death. She'd started in the kitchen, taking over cooking duties from old Pete, who'd been burning beans and overcooking beef for longer than anyone cared to remember. The first morning, she'd served breakfast fluffy biscuits, perfectly scrambled eggs, and coffee that didn't taste like saddle leather. The ranch hands had stared at their plates in wonder. "Ma'am," Tom Bradley had said, his young face serious as a judge, "if you ever decide to leave, we might just have to tie you to the barn." Lila had laughed, the first genuine laughter Colt had heard from Herond. The sound had done something to the atmosphere in the kitchen. Suddenly the room felt less like a place where lonely men grabbed quick meals and more like what it was meant to be, the heart of a home. Now, a week later, Colt sat on the porch watching Lila hang freshly washed curtains in the bunkhouse windows. She'd found the fabric in Sarah's sewing basket pail, yellow cotton printed with tiny blue flowers, and had spent her evenings cutting and hemming by lamplight. The curtains transformed the stark windows into something welcoming, homelike. "She's got an eye for making things pretty," Jake observed, settling into the chair beside Colt with his own cup of coffee. "Haven't seen curtains in the bunkhouse since, well, ever." Colt nodded, watching as Lila stood back to admire her work, hands on her hips in satisfaction. Everything she touched seemed to improve. The kitchen gleamed, wildflowers appeared in mason jars around the common areas, and somehow the very air felt cleaner, more hopeful. "You know the men are half in love with her already," Jake continued carefully. "She's young enough to be their daughter," Colt replied, but he'd noticed it too. The way Tom stumbled over his words when she spoke to him. How Pete had started combing his hair and washing his neck more regularly. Even gruff old Jake softened his voice when addressing her. "Age don't matter to a lonely heart," Jake said. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Colt could answer, Lila approached the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She moved with unconscious grace, and Colt found himself noticing details he tried not to see, the way afternoon light caught the red-gold highlights in her hair, how her smile reached her eyes when she felt safe and happy. "Mr. Avery," she said, her voice carrying the slight formality she insisted on maintaining despite his suggestions to call him Colt. "I was wondering if I might borrow a horse this afternoon. I'd like to ride to the creek and gather some herbs for cooking." "Take Thunder," Colt said without thinking, then immediately regretted it. Thunder had been Sarah's horse, and in 10 years no one else had ridden him. But Lila's face lit up with such genuine pleasure that his regret faded. "Are you certain? He's such a beautiful animal. I'd hate to." "He needs the exercise," Colt interrupted. "I'll saddle him for you." In the barn, Thunder nickered softly as Colt approached with the saddle. The big gelding had grown fat and lazy in recent years, more pet than working horse. But when Lila entered the barn, Thunder's ears pricked forward with interest. "Hello, beautiful," she murmured, stroking his neck with gentle hands. "Would you like to take me for a ride?" Thunder practically preened under her attention, and Colt felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy. Even his horse was falling under her spell. "He likes you," Colt observed, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. "Animals know when you mean them no harm," Lila replied, accepting his help mounting. "They can sense intentions better than people sometimes." As she rode away, sitting Thunder with natural ease, Colt wondered what intentions she might sense in him. Because increasingly, watching her bring life back to his world, he was having thoughts that had nothing to do with charity or protection. That evening, Lila returned with saddlebags full of wild herbs and a face flushed with happiness. Over dinner venison stew, seasoned with her gathered herbs, she described her afternoon with enthusiasm that made even the taciturn ranch hands smile. "There's a family of foxes denning near the creek," she said, eyes bright with discovery. "The kits are just old enough to play outside, and the wildflowers along the meadow, I've never seen such colors." "Spring comes late this far north," Colt said, "but when it arrives, it's worth the wait." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that had nothing to do with flowers or weather. Lila looked away first, color rising in her cheeks. After dinner, she insisted on washing dishes despite protests from the men. Colt found himself in the kitchen, ostensibly checking the coffee pot, but really just wanting to be near her. She hummed while she worked the same tune he'd heard her singing to the chicken sand. The domestic scene stirred memories he'd thought long buried. "That's a pretty song," he said. "My mother used to sing it," Lila replied, not looking up from the dishes. "One of the few things I remember about her. She died when I was 7. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but what else could a man say to such loss? She had consumption, wasted away slowly, but she kept singing until the very end. "My father was never the same after. I think that's why he married Mrs. Hawthorne so quickly he couldn't bear the silence in the house." Colt understood that kind of silence, the way it could swallow a person whole. "And Mrs. Hawthorne?" Lila's hands stilled in the soapy water. "She was different when my father was alive. Oh, she was never warm, but she wasn't cruel either. It was after he died that things changed. The gambling, the debts, the arrangements." The pain in her voice made Colt's chest tight. Without thinking, he moved closer, drawn by an instinct to comfort that surprised him with its strength. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, you're safe." Lila turned to face him, soap bubbles still clinging to her hands. They stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. For a moment, the kitchen felt too small, the air too thin. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." The honest answer was too complicated, too frightening to speak aloud, because she made him remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. Because her laughter had awakened parts of his heart he'd thought dead and buried. Because when she smiled at him across the dinner table, he felt like the man he used to be instead of the ghost he'd become. "Everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path," he said instead. But as he spoke the words, Colt realized they applied to him as much as to her. For 10 years, he'd chosen the path of solitude, of living in the past rather than facing the future. Now, watching Lila dry her hands on her apron, seeing the way she'd transformed his house from a shrine into a home, he wondered if it was time to choose differently. The curtains she'd hung that afternoon fluttered in the evening breeze, and through them, Colt could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Change was coming to the Amber Creek Ranch, could feel it in the air like the promise of rain. The question was whether he was brave enough to embrace it, or whether he'd let fear drive away the best thing that had happened to him in 10 long years. 2 weeks had passed since the curtains appeared in the bunkhouse windows, and Colt found himself noticing changes everywhere he looked. The ranch hands walked with more spring in their step, took more pride in their work, lingered longer over meals just to hear Lila's gentle conversation. Even the animals seemed more content. The cattle grazed peacefully, the horses nickered friendly greetings, and the barn cats had multiplied their purring by what seemed like tenfold. But it was the changes in himself that unsettled Colt most. He caught himself listening for Lila's voice in the morning, watching for her figure moving about the ranch, timing his meals to coincide with hers. The careful routine he'd maintained for 10 years had been quietly disrupted, replaced by something that felt dangerously like hope. That morning, he'd awakened to find her in the main house kitchen, standing before the window that looked out over Sarah's garden. The plot had gone to weeds years ago, but Lila was studying it with the intensity of an architect examining blueprints. "It must have been beautiful," she said when she noticed him in the doorway. Colt poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already prepared, another small kindness that had become routine. "Sarah spent hours out there, said it was her sanctuary. Would you mind if I tried to restore it? I know it's not my place to suggest." "You don't need permission to tend a garden," Colt interrupted, but his voice was gentler than his words. The truth was, he'd been avoiding that plot for a decade, unable to bear either its neglect or the work of maintaining it. "I'd like to see what she planted, try to bring back what's salvageable." Lila's voice carried careful respect. My mother had a garden. I remember helping her when I was small. That afternoon, Colt had watched from the porch as Lila knelt in the overgrown plot, carefully separating weeds from the hardy perennials that had survived years of neglect. She worked with patient hands, speaking softly to the plants, as if encouraging them to remember their purpose. When she discovered a struggling rose bush buried beneath a tangle of wild morning glory, her cry of delight had carried across the yard like music. Now evening had fallen, and Colt found himself drawn to the main house, despite his usual preference for solitude. He'd taken to eating dinner there more often, telling himself it was to keep Lila company, but knowing the truth ran deeper. The house felt alive again when she was in it, not like the museum, to dead love it had become, but like the home Sarah had always intended it to be. He found Lila in the parlor, sitting in the chair by the window, with something in her hands. As he approached, he realized she was holding Sarah's small wooden cross, the one that had sat on the mantelpiece for 10 years, gathering dust and memories. "I was cleaning," Lila said quickly, as if apologizing for touching something sacred. "I found this fallen behind the table. It's beautiful work." Colt settled into his usual chair, the one that faced Sarah's across the cold fireplace. Sarah's father carved it for her when she was confirmed. She carried it west when we married. Lila turned the cross over in her hands, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the wood. She must have treasured it. She did. The words came easier than Colt expected. For years, talking about Sarah had felt like reopening a wound. But somehow, with Lila, the memories felt less like pain and more like remembrance. She said it reminded her that faith wasn't about understanding God's plan, but about trusting that there was one. "Do you still believe that?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and unafraid. Lila's green eyes held no judgment, only genuine curiosity about the man who'd opened his home to her. "I did once," Colt said slowly. "When Sarah was dying, she made me promise to keep believing, to keep living. But after she was gone," he shrugged, unable to finish the thought. "But you did keep living," Lila said gently. "You built something lasting here. You employ good men, treat them fairly, provide for them. You help people like me when they need it most. Maybe that's faith too, just a different kind." Colt looked at her, really looked, and saw wisdom that had no business existing in someone so young. But then, he supposed, loss and hardship aged a person in ways that had nothing to do with years. "What about you?" he asked. "Do you have faith?" Lila was quiet for a long moment, still holding the wooden cross. "I used to pray every night that Mrs. Hawthorne would change, that she'd remember I was her husband's daughter and treat me with kindness. When that didn't happen, I prayed for escape. And then, on the worst night of my life, you appeared in that storm like an answer I'd stopped expecting." She looked up at him, and something in her expression made Colt's chest tighten. "So yes, I think I still have faith. Not in the God who lets stepmothers sell their children, but in the one who sends good men to help when all seems lost." The words hit Colt like a physical blow. Good man. When had he started thinking of himself that way again? For years, he'd simply existed, moving through days without purpose, beyond survival. But Lila's presence had reminded him of who he used to be, man who protected what mattered, who built instead of just maintaining. "You give me too much credit," he said. "Do I?" Lila rose from her chair and moved to replace the cross on the mantelpiece, her movements careful and reverent. "In 2 weeks, you've given me safety, purpose, and the first real home I've known since my father died. You've risked your own peace to protect mine. If that's not goodness, I don't know what is." She turned back to face him, and in the lamplight, she looked older than her 21-year woman who'd learned to recognize genuine kindness because she'd known its absence. "I want you to know," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it, "that whatever happens with Mrs. Hawthorne, whatever the courts decide, these weeks here have been a gift. You've shown me that not all men see women as property to be bought and sold. You've given me hope that there might be another kind of life possible." Colt felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. "Lila, I know you loved your wife," she said quickly, as if she needed to get the words out before courage failed her. "I would never presume to replace her memory or try to fill the space she left behind. But I hope you know that caring for someone new doesn't diminish what you had before. Love isn't a finite resource that gets used up." The wisdom in her words stole his breath. Here was this young woman who had every reason to be bitter and cynical about love, trying to comfort him in his grief, teaching him with gentle patience that healing didn't require forgetting. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Lila smiled, and it transformed her face from pretty to radiant. "Pain teaches us things we wish we didn't need to know, but it also teaches us to recognize healing when it comes." That night, after Lila had retired to her room in the bunkhouse, Colt sat alone in the parlor, staring at Sarah's cross on the mantelpiece. For the first time in 10 years, the silence in the house didn't feel like an accusation. It felt peaceful, expectant, as if the very walls were holding their breath for whatever came next. He pulled Sarah's locket from his pocket and opened it, looking at the tiny daguerreotype inside his wife's face, forever young, forever smiling. For years, this image had been his anchor to the past, his excuse for avoiding the future. "What should I do, Sarah?" he whispered to the photograph. "She's so young, so full of life. She deserves better than a broken-down widower who's forgotten how to live." But even as he spoke the words, he could almost hear Sarah's voice in reply, not the bitter, pain-racked voice of her final days, but the strong, loving voice of their early years together. She would tell him to stop being such a fool. She would remind him that love was meant to heal, not wound. She would probably box his ears for wasting 10 years in lonely grief when he could have been living, loving, building something new on the foundation of what they'd shared. The locket felt lighter in his hands suddenly, not an anchor dragging him down, but a blessing sent forward from the past. Sarah had made him promise to keep living, and maybe, just maybe, that promise included this: the possibility that a young woman with eyes like spring water and a voice like morning bird song might be exactly what his heart needed to remember how to beat properly again. Outside, a night bird called across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, peaceful and secure under Colt's protection. But for the first time in years, Colt found himself thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he might yet find. In the morning, he decided, he would ask Lila to show him what she'd discovered in Sarah's garden. It was time to see what could grow from ground that had been left fallow too long. The spring roundup brought neighbors from miles around to the Amber Creek Ranch, their arrival marked by clouds of dust and the distant lowing of cattle. It was an annual tradition, ranchers helping each other gather their herds for branding and sorting before the summer grazing season. For Colt, it had always been a time of hard work and friendly competition, but this year felt different. This year, he had Lila. She'd been nervous about meeting so many new people at once, worried about questions she couldn't answer and suspicions she couldn't allay. But Colt had reassured her that ranch folk respected privacy and valued actions over words. Still, he found himself watching her carefully as the wagons rolled in, ready to step between her and any uncomfortable attention. The first to arrive were the Hendersons from the Double H Doc Henderson and his wife Martha, along with their 3 grown sons and their families. Martha took one look at Lila and swept her into the kind of maternal embrace that brooked no argument. "So you're the young lady who's got Colt looking human again," Martha declared, holding Lila at arm's length to study her face. About time someone brought some sense to this stubborn old goat. Behind them came the Carlsons, the Morgans, and the Davies, family good people who'd worked together through drought and plenty, who'd helped bury each other's dead and celebrate each other's joys. By midday, the ranch hummed with activity as dozens of riders spread out across the range, their voices echoing off the hills as they gathered the scattered cattle. Lila had thrown herself into helping with the cooking, working alongside the ranch wives to prepare meals for 40 hungry people. Colt watched her move between the outdoor kitchens with natural grace, her sleeves rolled up and flower in her hair, and felt a pride that surprised him with its intensity. "She fits in well," observed Samuel Carlson, settling beside Colt on the porch steps. Samuel was a man of Colt's own age, weathered by the same sun and wind, shaped by the same challenges of ranch life. "She's got a good heart," Colt replied, accepting the cup of coffee Samuel offered. "Pretty too," Samuel added with a meaningful look. "Young enough to give you a decade or two of happiness if you've got the sense to see what's in front of you." Before Colt could respond, a commotion erupted near the corrals. Young Billy Morgan, all of 16 and full of the swagger that comes with believing yourself invincible, was attempting to impress the ladies by riding a particularly ornery bronc. The horse had other ideas. Colt was on his feet before Billy hit the ground, but Lila reached the fallen boy first. She knelt beside him, her hands gentle but confident as she checked for injuries, speaking in the calm, soothing voice she used with frightened animals. "Easy now," she murmured as Billy groaned and tried to sit up. "You took quite a tumble. Let's make sure nothing's broken before you start moving around." Dr. Henderson arrived moments later, but Lila had already determined that Billy's pride was more damaged than his body. A few bruises, a scraped elbow, and a valuable lesson about respecting horses with attitude problems. "Where'd you learn to tend injuries like that?" asked Mary Carlson, Samuel's daughter-in-law, as they watched Billy limp away under his mother's protective wing. "My stepmother didn't believe in coddling," Lila replied simply. "If you got hurt, you learned to patch yourself up or do without." The words were spoken without self-pity, but Colt saw the way some of the women exchanged glances. They'd all heard the story by now sanitized versions of how Lila had come to be at the ranch, but enough to understand she'd fled from something ugly. As the afternoon wore on, Colt found himself the subject of good-natured ribbing from his neighbors. Comments about how well he looked, jokes about the improved quality of meals at the Amber Creek, pointed observations about how nice it was to see curtains in the windows again. "You planning on making it official?" asked Tom Davies during a break in the branding. "That girl's got too much class to be living in the bunkhouse indefinitely." "It's complicated," Colt said, focusing intently on the iron in his hands. "Complicated how? You're both single, both of age, both clearly taken with each other. Seems simple enough to me." But it wasn't simple, and Colt knew it. There was the matter of Mrs. Hawthorne and her legal threats, the question of whether a man of 58 had any business courting a woman of 21, and the deeper issue of whether his heart was truly ready to love again, or if he was simply lonely enough to mistake gratitude for something deeper. The evening brought music and dancing, as it always did during Roundup. Someone had brought a fiddle, another a guitar, and soon the area between the house and barn had been cleared for dancing. Lanterns hung from posts and fence rails, casting warm pools of light across the gathered crowd. Colt stood in the shadows, nursing a whiskey, and watching as neighbor couples took their turns on the makeshift dance floor. The music was lively, the laughter genuine, and for a moment he could almost forget the complications that shadowed his life. Then he saw Lila emerge from the kitchen, her hair pinned up and her face flushed from the heat of cooking. She'd changed into her one good dresser, simple green cotton that brought out her eye sand. She looked so lovely that Colt's chest tightened. Almost immediately, she was surrounded by young men eager for a dance partner. Billy Morgan, recovered from his earlier humiliation, was first in line, followed by two of the Carlson boys and several of the unmarried ranch hands from neighboring spreads. Colt told himself he was pleased to see her enjoying herself, that she deserved the attention of men closer to her own age. But watching her laugh as young Tom Carlson spun her around the dance floor, seeing the way her face lit up when Billy attempted an elaborate bow, he felt something dark and unwelcome twist in his stomach. Jealousy, pure and simple and completely inappropriate for a man of his years. "Going to stand there all night looking like someone stole your favorite horse?" Jake appeared at his elbow, grinning with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been proven right about something. "I don't know what you're talking about," Colt replied, but his eyes never left Lila as she danced. "Sure you don't. That's why you look ready to challenge young Tom to a duel over a simple waltz." The song ended, and immediately another young man stepped forward to claim Lila's hand. She glanced around the crowd as if looking for someone, her eyes finding Colt's across the distance. For a moment, their gazes held, and he saw something in her expression that made his heart receive question, an invitation, a hope that he might step out of the shadows and claim what every instinct told him was his. But before he could move, Samuel Carlson approached Lila with the courtesy of an older, married man asking for a dance that was about friendship rather than courtship. She accepted graciously, and Colt let the moment pass, telling himself he was being sensible. "You're a fool, Colt Avery," Jake said quietly. "That girl's been looking for you all evening, and you're standing here in the dark feeling sorry for yourself. She's young. She's a woman, not a child. And she's got eyes only for you, despite all these young bucks strutting around like peacocks." As if to prove Jake's point, Lila looked toward the shadows again during her dance with Samuel, her smile dimming slightly when she didn't see Colt approaching. "Besides," Jake continued, "age ain't nothing but numbers when two people fit together the way you two do. Sarah wouldn't want you spending the rest of your life alone, and you know it." The mention of Sarah's name should have stung, but instead it brought a strange sort of peace. Because Jake was right, Sarah had been generous with her love, quick to see the good in people, eager to embrace happiness wherever it could be found. She would have liked Lila, would have seen past the age difference to the deeper compatibility that Colt was only beginning to acknowledge. The music changed to a slower waltz, and Colt found himself moving before conscious thought could stop him. He crossed the dance floor with determined steps, ignoring the knowing looks from his neighbors, focusing only on Lila's face as she realized he was approaching. "Miss McKenna," he said formally, extending his hand as Samuel stepped back with a knowing smile. "Would you honor me with a dance?" The relief and joy that flooded her features was answer enough, but she managed a proper, "I would be delighted, Mr. Avery," before placing her hand in his. Dancing with Lila was nothing like dancing with Sarah had been. Sarah had been tall and willowy, her movements graceful but reserved. Lila was smaller, more vivacious, and she followed his lead with an intuitive ease that made him feel like a much better dancer than he actually was. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how," she said as they moved together across the packed earth. "Just rusty," he replied, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms, how right it felt to hold her close while the music swirled around them. "The ladies have been asking about us," Lila said, her voice carefully neutral, making assumptions about our arrangement. "Let them talk. People will think what they want to think regardless of what we tell them." "And what do you want them to think?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. What did he want? The honest answer was complicated, frightening, and undeniable. He wanted them to think that Lila Grace McKenna belonged to him, that she'd chosen him despite their differences, that together they were building something worth defending against all threats. But before he could find words for such dangerous thoughts, the music ended and reality intruded. Mrs. Davies was approaching with questions about tomorrow's breakfast preparations, and young Billy Morgan was hovering nearby with obvious intentions of claiming another dance. Colt released Lila reluctantly, his hand lingering on hers for just a moment longer than propriety demanded. "Thank you for the dance, Miss McKenna." "Thank you for asking, Mr. Avery." But as she was swept away by Billy's enthusiastic invitation, Colt saw her look back over her shoulder with an expression that promised their conversation was far from over. The evening had changed. Something between them crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, acknowledged a truth that couldn't be ignored. Standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching Lila laugh at something Billy whispered in her ear, Colt fingered the branding iron in his pocket, the iron that marked cattle as belonging to the Amber Creek Ranch. For the first time, he found himself thinking about other kinds of belonging, other kinds of claims that had nothing to do with law or property, and everything to do with the choice two people made to face the world together. Tomorrow the neighbors would return to their own ranches, taking their questions and assumptions with them. But tonight had planted seeds that would grow whether Colt tended them or not. The question was whether he had the courage to help them flourish, or whether fear would make him a fool twice in one lifetime. The week following the roundup brought an unusual tension to the ranch, as if the easy rhythm Colt and Lila had established had been disrupted by the dance they'd shared and the questions it raised. They found themselves awkward around each other too, aware of lingering glances, too careful with casual touches, too conscious of the space between them during shared meals. Colt threw himself into ranch business with the determination of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. There were fences to mend, cattle to move to summer pasture, and the endless maintenance that kept a spread like Amber Creek running smoothly. But even hard physical labor couldn't quiet the memory of how Lila had felt in his arms, or the way she'd looked at him when the music ended. It was Jake who finally forced the issue, cornering Colt in the barn on a Thursday morning when patience had worn thin. "This is getting ridiculous," Jake said without preamble, blocking Colt's path to Thunder's stall. "You're moping around like a lovesick schoolboy. She's jumping every time you enter a room, and the rest of us are walking on eggshells, trying not to say the wrong thing." "I don't know what you're talking about," Colt replied, but the words lacked conviction. "You're going to lose her," Jake said bluntly. "Keep acting like she's made of spun glass, and she'll start believing you don't want her here. Women need to know where they stand, Colt, especially women who've been treated like property instead of people." The truth of Jake's words hit home. In trying to be respectful, to give Lila space to make her own choices, Colt had created uncertainty where clarity was needed. But the solution seemed fraught with its own dangers. "She's 21, Jake. I'm old enough to be her father. So was your own father when he married your mother. Age gaps ain't uncommon out here, and they ain't automatically wrong either. Question is whether you care for her and whether she cares for you. Everything else is just noise." That afternoon, Colt found himself riding to town with purposes beyond the usual supply run. Ezra Morrison's law office occupied the second floor of Cheyenne's First National Bank, its windows overlooking the dusty main street. The lawyer greeted Colt with the weary expression of a man bearing unwelcome news. "I've been researching territorial marriage laws," Morrison said, gesturing for Colt to take a seat. "Specifically, what legal protections marriage might offer Miss McKenna against Mrs. Hawthorne's claims." Colt's pulse quickened. And marriage would indeed provide substantial protection. As a married woman, Miss McKenna would be under her husband's legal authority rather than her stepmother's. The marriage contract Mrs. Hawthorne holds would become void automatically. "But," Morrison's expression grew grave, "but there's a complication. I've received word that Mrs. Hawthorne has filed additional charges with the territorial court. She's claiming that Miss McKenna stole property when she fled jewelry, money, clothing. If those charges stick, marriage won't protect her from prosecution for theft." Colt felt ice settle in his stomach. "What kind of property?" "Family heirlooms, apparently. Items Mrs. Hawthorne claims belonged to her late husband's family and should have remained in the household." Morrison shuffled through papers on his desk. "The descriptions are vague, but if she can produce witnesses to swear that Miss McKenna took these items, she's making it up." "Probably, but proving that in court will be difficult, especially if Mrs. Hawthorne has money to buy testimony." Morrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Colt, if you're thinking of marrying this girl to protect her, you need to understand that you'd be taking on all her legal troubles. Mrs. Hawthorne could go after your property, your ranch, everything you've built." Colt stared out the window at the busy street below, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary lives. None of them were facing the choice between safety and love, between the practical and the right. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The territorial marshal will be through next month to investigate the theft charges. If he finds probable cause, he'll arrest Miss McKenna and transport her back to face trial." Morrison's voice gentled. "I'm sorry, Colt. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." The ride back to the ranch gave Colt time to think, but thinking only made the situation feel more impossible. Marrying Lila would protect her from the marriage contract, but expose her to criminal charges. Not marrying her left her vulnerable to both threats. And underneath all the legal complications was the deeper question of whether he was motivated by love or by some misguided sense of duty. He found Lila in Sarah's garden, kneeling among the roses she'd coaxed back to life. The plants were thriving under her care, their blooms fuller and more fragrant than they'd been even in Sarah's time. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "You look troubled," she said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her hands. "Bad news from town?" Colt studied her face, the open concern, the trust that he would tell her the truth, the strength that had carried her through abandonment and betrayal. Jake was right. She deserved honesty, deserved to know where she stood and what choices lay ahead. "We need to talk," he said. "Really talk about what's been happening between us and what it might mean." Lila's expression grew serious, but she nodded. "I've been hoping you'd say that. This past week has been difficult." They walked to the porch and settled into chairs that had become familiar territories, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Colt found himself studying his hands, struggling to find words for feelings he'd kept buried for so long. "I need you to know," he began slowly, "that what I feel for you has nothing to do with charity or obligation. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I started caring about you in ways that go beyond protection." Lila's breath caught, but she didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. "But I also need you to know that caring for you could cost you everything. Morrison says Mrs. Hawthorne has filed theft charges against you. Marriage might protect you from one threat, but it would expose you to another." "What kind of theft charges?" Colt explained what Morrison had told him, watching Lila's face grow pale as the implications sank in. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She's claiming I stole my mother's jewelry," Lila said finally, her voice bitter with understanding. "The pieces my father gave me after my mother died. She took them from me when I turned 18, said they were too valuable for a child to own. I suppose now she's using them as evidence of theft." "Did you take them when you left?" "I tried to, but she'd hidden them. I couldn't find them in the time I had." Lila's laugh was sharp and humorless. "So now she gets to keep my mother's jewelry and use my attempt to reclaim it as evidence that I'm a thief." Colt felt anger surge through him, not just at Mrs. Hawthorne's manipulations, but at a legal system that gave such power to someone so willing to abuse it. "Morrison thinks we have options, but they're all risky. And marriage, what would that mean, practically speaking?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Colt found himself looking into Lila's eyes, seeing not the desperate girl he'd rescued from the storm, but the woman she'd become, strong, wise, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with character. "It would mean you'd be under my protection legally. Mrs. Hawthorne's marriage contract would become void. But it would also mean sharing whatever consequences come from these theft charges." "And personally, what would it mean personally?" The directness of her question demanded an equally direct answer. Colt thought of the land deed documents in his study papers that represented everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for. A smart man would protect those assets, would find a way to help Lila without risking his own security. But looking at her now, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, Colt realized that being smart mattered less than being true to what his heart was telling him. "It would mean building a life together," he said quietly. "It would mean sharing more than just legal protection. It would mean—" He paused, then forced himself to say the words that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "It would mean I love you, Lila Grace, and I want to spend whatever years I have left showing you what that means." Tears spilled down Lila's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too, Colt Avery. I've been trying not to, telling myself I was too grateful to trust my own feelings, that you were just being kind to a woman in trouble. But I love you not for what you've given me, but for who you are. For the man who sees people's worth instead of their usefulness." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the magnitude of their mutual confession settle between them. Then Lila leaned forward, her voice urgent with decision. "Ask me," she said. "Ask me properly so there's no question about what we're choosing." Colt stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his weathered ones. At 58, he felt like a foolish old man proposing to a woman who deserved better. But he also felt more alive than he had in 10 years. "Lila Grace McKenna," he said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Will you marry me? Will you take on my name and my protection, my love and my troubles, and help me remember what it means to build a future instead of just surviving the present?" "Yes," she whispered, and then louder. "Yes, Colt Avery, I will marry you." As he kissed her there on the porch, with the sun setting over the land he'd built and the woman he loved in his arms, Colt felt something shift in his chest. The weight he'd carried for 10 years didn't disappear, but it transformed no longer an anchor dragging him down, but ballast that would help him weather whatever storms lay ahead. Tomorrow they would ride to town and speak with the preacher. Tomorrow they would file the papers that would make their union legal and binding. Tomorrow they would begin the complicated work of building a marriage under the shadow of legal threats and social scrutiny. But tonight, they simply held each other and marveled at the unexpected gift of second chances, at the way love could grow in the most unlikely soil and bloom, despite every reason it shouldn't survive. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Lila had spent the previous evening altering Sarah's wedding dresser, simple but elegant ivory silk that needed only minor adjustments to fit her smaller frame. She'd found it carefully preserved in a cedar chest, wrapped in tissue paper and lavender sachets, and had asked Colt's permission with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. Sarah would want it worn again, Colt had said, though his voice caught slightly on the words. She always said a wedding dress should bring joy, not gather dust. Now, as Lila stood before the mirror in the main house bedroom, she felt the weight of tradition and hope settling around her shoulders like a blessing. The dress fit perfectly, its simple lines elegant rather than ornate, its age lending it a dignity that newer gowns often lacked. Martha Henderson had arrived early to help with preparations, bringing wildflowers from her own garden and enough food to feed the small gathering of friends who would witness the ceremony. Doc Henderson would serve as one witness, Jake as the other, and Pastor Williams had agreed to perform the service in the parlor where Colt and Sarah had spent so many quiet evenings. "You look beautiful, dear," Martha said, adjusting the small veil that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. "Nervous?" "Terrified," Lila admitted with a shaky laugh. "Not about marrying Colt, that feels right in every way possible, but about everything else. Mrs. Hawthorne's threats, the legal complications, the fact that I'm wearing another woman's dress to marry the man who loved her first." "Love isn't a competition, child," Martha said gently. "It's not about who came first or who loved longer. It's about recognizing when God gives you a chance at happiness and having the courage to take it." Meanwhile, in the barn, Colt was receiving his own preparation lecture from Jake, who'd taken it upon himself to ensure the groom didn't develop cold feet at the crucial moment. "You clean up good for an old codger," Jake observed, straightening Colt's tie. "Sarah's dress fits Lila well?" "Like it was made for her," Colt replied, then caught Jake's knowing look. "Not in any mystical way, just practically." "Sure," Jake said with a grin. "Nothing mystical about any of this. Just a man who thought his life was over, getting a second chance at happiness with a woman who thinks he hung the moon. Purely practical." At precisely 10 o'clock, the small party gathered in the parlor. Pastor Williams, a man of 70 with kind eyes and gentle hands, had known both Colt and Sarah since their early days in the territory. He'd presided over their first wedding 30 years ago, had comforted Colt through Sarah's final illness, and now stood ready to bless this unexpected new beginning. Colt waited at the makeshift altar, really just the space before the fireplace, decorated with Martha's wild flowers, wearing his best suit and feeling simultaneously like the luckiest man alive and a fraud who didn't deserve such happiness. When Lila appeared in the doorway, looking radiant in Sarah's dress, his breath caught in his throat. She moved toward him with quiet grace, her eyes never leaving his face, and when she reached his side, she whispered, "No regrets?" "None," he replied, meaning it completely. Pastor Williams opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words that had joined countless couples in bonds of love and commitment. But just as he reached the part about speaking now, or forever holding peace, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the ceremony. Everyone froze as the sounds grew closer, not the casual approach of a neighbor, but the purposeful advance of multiple riders. Through the window, Colt could see dust rising from the road, and his stomach clenched with familiar dread. "Expecting someone?" Doc Henderson asked quietly. Before Colt could answer, a knock echoed through the house, polite but insistent, the kind of knock that wouldn't be ignored. Jake moved toward the door, his hand instinctively resting on his gun, but Colt waved him back. "I'll handle it," Colt said, though he suspected handling was beyond anyone's power now. The man at the door was elderly, perhaps 80, with white hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. He wore the simple black clothing of a circuit preacher, and his eyes held the kind of deep sadness that comes from witnessing too much of life's cruelty. "Mr. Avery," the old man said, "I'm Pastor Jeremiah McNeil. I was wondering if I might have a word with you and the young lady you're about to marry." "We already have a pastor," Colt replied, but something in the old man's expression made him step back and allow entry. Pastor McNeil entered slowly, his gaze sweeping across the wedding party with growing recognition. When his eyes settled on Lila, still beautiful in her wedding dress, his face went pale. "Dear God," he whispered. "It's true then. She's the very image of her mother." "I'm sorry?" Lila stepped forward, confused by the stranger's reaction. "Do we know each other?" Pastor McNeil's hand shook as he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age, creased from handling, but clearly official. "Miss McKenna, I've traveled 200 miles to bring you this. It's your mother's birth certificate and some other documents that I believe you need to see." Lila took the papers with trembling fingers, Colt moving to stand beside her as she unfolded them. The first was indeed a birth certificate, but the name on it made no sense. "Sarah Elizabeth McKenna," Lila read aloud, then looked up in confusion. "This can't be right. My mother's name was Mary Catherine." "Your mother changed her name when she left home," Pastor McNeil said gently. "Sarah Elizabeth McKenna was her birth name. She was born in my parish, baptized in my church, and before she ran away at 17, she was the light of her father's life." The world seemed to tilt around Lila as understanding began to dawn. "Sarah. My mother's name was Sarah. She gave birth to you in secret," Pastor McNeil continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "The father was a married man who couldn't acknowledge the child. Sarah, your mother, gave you to her cousin Catherine to raise, then disappeared. We heard she'd married and moved west, but we never knew where." Colt felt ice forming in his veins as the implications crashed over him. "What are you saying?" Pastor McNeil turned to him with eyes full of sorrow and certainty. "Mr. Avery, the woman you married 30 years ago, Sarah McKenna, Avery was this young lady's mother. Lila Grace McKenna is your late wife's daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Lila stared at the documents in her hands, her face white as the wedding dress she wore. Colt felt the world spinning around him, everything he thought he knew crumbling into dust and confusion. "That's impossible," Lila whispered. "My mother died when I was 7. She was married to my father. She lived in Kansas. She never mentioned." "She lived under the name Mary Catherine McKenna," Pastor McNeil confirmed sadly. "But she was born Sarah Elizabeth, and the records prove it. I have her baptismal certificate, her father's letters, even a daguerreotype from her 16th birthday." He produced the photograph, and even in its faded sepia tones, the resemblance was unmistakable. The woman in the picture looked exactly like Lila would, in 10 years' time, the same green eyes, the same delicate features, the same spirit shining through despite obvious hardship. "Sarah wrote to me once, after her marriage," Pastor McNeil continued. "She said she'd found peace with a good man named William McKenna. that she was trying to build a new life and put the past behind her. She mentioned a daughter she'd had to give up, said she prayed every day that the child was safe and loved. "But how did you know to find me here?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Hawthorne contacted our church 3 months ago, researching your family history for what she claimed were inheritance purposes. When she described you and mentioned your mother's name, I knew immediately who you were. I've been trying to reach you ever since, but Mrs. Hawthorne kept saying you were unavailable." Colt felt sick as understanding dawned. She knew, Mrs. Hawthorne knew who Lila really was, and she used it to... He couldn't finish the thought. The cruelty was too enormous, too calculated. "She knew I was Sarah's daughter," Lila said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "She knew, and she still tried to sell me to that gambling man. She still..." Her voice broke, and she looked at Colt with eyes full of horror and dawning realization. "And now I'm wearing my mother's wedding dress, about to marry the man who loved her first, the man who..." "No," Colt said desperately, reaching for her hands. "Lila, this doesn't change anything between us. I love you, not some ghost of the past. You're not her, you're yourself, and what I feel for you is real and separate from anything I felt for Sarah." But even as he spoke the words, Colt could see the damage spreading across Lila's face like poison. The joy of their wedding morning was curdling into something twisted and wrong. Everything that had felt pure and hopeful now seemed tainted by implications neither of them could face. "I'm wearing her dress," Lila repeated, looking down at the ivory silk with revulsion. "I'm living in her house, sleeping in her bed, falling in love with her husband. And all this time, she was my mother. My mother, who I barely remember, who I thought was dead and buried in Kansas." "Lila, don't." She backed away from him, the wedding bouquet falling forgotten to the floor. "This is wrong. All of it. How can we know if what we feel is real or just some sick echo of the past? How can we trust our own hearts when they've led us into something so..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Colt heard the unspoken word hanging in the air between them. Twisted, unnatural, wrong. Pastor Williams cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony until you've both had time to process this information." "No," Lila said, her voice growing stronger with decision. "There won't be a ceremony. There can't be. Not now, not knowing what I know." She turned and fled from the room, leaving Colt standing in his wedding suit, surrounded by wilted flowers and the ruins of the happiness he'd thought was finally within reach. The forged birth certificate lay on the floor where she'd dropped it, and Colt stared at it with a mixture of rage and despair. Mrs. Hawthorne had known. She'd known from the beginning who Lila was, and she'd used that knowledge as another weapon in her campaign of cruelty. The marriage contract, the theft charges, even allowing Lila to flee to his ranchette, had all been part of some elaborate, vicious game. "I'm sorry," Pastor McNeil said quietly. "I thought you should know the truth. I never imagined it would cause such pain." Colt looked at the old man and saw genuine grief in his eyes. Pastor McNeil had acted from kindness, believing that truth was always better than lies. But sometimes, Colt thought bitterly, the truth arrived like a thunderbolt, destroying everything it touched. "What am I supposed to do now?" Colt asked, not really expecting an answer. But it was Jake who replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You're supposed to fight for her. You're supposed to remind her that love doesn't get cancelled out by blood relations or twisted family trees. You're supposed to prove that what you two have is real and worth protecting, no matter what anyone else thinks." Through the window, Colt could see Lila running toward the barn, still wearing Sarah's wedding dress, her veil streaming behind her like a banner of surrender. Everything in him wanted to follow, to hold her until the shock passed and reason returned. But he also knew that some revelations cut too deep for comfort. Some truths were too large to be easily absorbed. Lila would need time to process what she'd learned, to separate the daughter she'd been from the woman she'd become, to decide whether their love could survive such an unlikely foundation. The question was whether he'd have the patience to wait for her answer, and whether that answer would be worth the agony of hoping. 3 days had passed since the wedding that never was, and the ranch felt like a house in mourning. Colt moved through his daily routines with mechanical precision, but the joy had leached out of everything. The cattle still needed tending, the fences still required mending, and life still demanded its endless succession of small decisions and large responsibilities. But it all felt hollow now, like going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Lila had locked herself in the bunkhouse room, emerging only for necessities and refusing to speak to anyone beyond basic courtesies. She'd changed out of Sarah's wedding dress and folded it carefully back into its tissue paper shroud, as if by returning it to its proper place she could undo the revelations that had shattered their future. The ranch hands walked on eggshells, their usual easy camaraderie replaced by uncomfortable silence. They'd witnessed the wedding preparations, seen the joy on both faces, and now they watched helplessly as their boss retreated into the bitter solitude he'd inhabited before Lila's arrival. It was Jake who finally forced the issue, as Jake usually did when problems required confronting rather than avoiding. "This has gone on long enough," he announced, bursting into the main house where Colt sat staring into the cold fireplace. "That girl's eating herself alive with guilt and confusion, and you're letting her do it." "What would you have me do?" Colt asked without looking up. "Force her to accept a situation that makes her sick to think about? I'd have you remind her that love doesn't follow bloodlines or make sense on paper. I'd have you fight for what you both want, instead of letting some twisted old woman's manipulations destroy your happiness." "Mrs. Hawthorne didn't create this situation, Jake. She just revealed it. She created it the moment she decided to use that girl's parentage as a weapon." Jake's voice was sharp with frustration. "Can't you see what she's done? She's not just trying to get Lila back, she's trying to destroy both of you, making you question everything you feel, making Lila ashamed of loving a good man." Before Colt could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But this time, the riders came in 4C, dozen men, led by Mrs. Hawthorne herself, all armed and looking like they meant business. "Looks like talking time is over," Jake muttered, his hand moving to his gun. Colt stood slowly, his own hand settling on the familiar weight of his Colt 45. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Hawthorne dismounting with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. Behind her, Sheriff Dalton looked uncomfortable but determined, while the hired men spread out in positions that suggested they'd done this kind of thing before. "Mr. Avery," Mrs. Hawthorne called from the yard, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I believe we have some business to conclude." Colt stepped onto the porch, Jake flanking him, both men projecting the kind of calm readiness that came from years of facing down trouble. "What kind of business would that be, Mrs. Hawthorne?" "The kind that ends with my stepdaughter coming home where she belongs. Mrs. WW.com. Hawthorne's smile was sharp as a blade. "I understand your little wedding didn't quite work out as planned. Something about inconvenient family connections." The casual cruelty in her voice made Colt's jaw clench. "You knew all along who she was." "Of course I knew. Sarah McKenna Avery was quite famous in certain circles, the young woman who disappeared with a secret shame, only to surface years later as a respectable ranch wife. I make it my business to know these things." "Then you know what you put her through, what you put both of us through." Mrs. Hawthorne shrugged with theatrical indifference. "I offered her a perfectly reasonable marriage to a man of property and standing. She chose to flee to her mother's former husband instead. Really, the irony is quite delicious." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, looking increasingly uncomfortable with his role in this drama. "Mr. Avery, I've got a warrant for Miss McKenna's arrest on charges of theft. I need to take her back for trial." "What theft?" Jake demanded. "The girl left with nothing but the clothes on her back. Family jewelry, specifically items belonging to her late father's estate." Mrs. Hawthorne produced a list with practiced ease. A pearl necklace, diamond earrings, a gold brooch documented as missing after her departure. "Documented by whom?" Colt asked. "By me, as her legal guardian and executor of her father's estate." The legal trap was elegant in its simplicity. Mrs. Hawthorne had covered every angle, anticipated every defense, prepared for every contingency. But as Colt studied her triumphant expression, he realized something important. She was here in force because she wasn't certain of victory. If the law was truly on her side, she wouldn't need 12 armed men to collect one frightened girl. "I'd like to see that warrant," Colt said. Sheriff Dalton handed over the document, and Colt read it carefully. The charges were specific, the descriptions detailed, but something about the timing felt wrong. "This warrant is dated 3 days ago," Colt observed, "the same day Pastor McNeil arrived with those birth certificates." "A coincidence," Mrs. Hawthorne said smoothly, but Colt caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Is it? Or did you file these charges the moment you realized your first plan had failed? When the wedding was called off and you knew I couldn't protect Lila through marriage?" Before Mrs. Hawthorne could answer, Lila emerged from the bunkhouse, walking toward them with the deliberate pace of someone who'd reached a difficult decision. She wore her simple brown traveling dress and carried a small beige everything she owned in the world. "There's no need for all this drama," Lila said, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. "I'll come with you willingly." "No," Colt said, moving to intercept her. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." Lila's green eyes met his, and he saw a depth of pain that made his chest ache. "I can't stay here, Colt, not knowing what I know. Every time I look at you, I see the confusion in your eyes. Am I the woman you love, or am I just an echo of the woman you lost? And every time I look in the mirror, I wonder the same thing." "You're not an echo," Colt said desperately. "You're yourself, unique and precious and completely separate from anything I felt for Sarah." "How can you be sure? How can either of us be sure?" Lila's voice cracked slightly. "Mrs. Hawthorne is right about one thing. The irony is too great to ignore. Of all the ranches in all the territory, I had to flee to yours. Of all the men who could have helped me, it had to be the one who loved my mother. That's not coincidence, Colt. That's fate playing a cruel joke." Mrs. Hawthorne watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction, like a cat watching mice struggle in a trap of her own devising. "How touching. But I'm afraid sentiment won't resolve legal matters. Sheriff Dalton, please arrest Miss McKenna." But as the sheriff moved forward, Colt noticed movement from the bunkhouse. Tom and Pete had emerged, rifles in their hands, moving to flank the yard. From the barn, he could see Doc Henderson's oldest son positioning himself behind cover. Word had spread somehow, and help was arriving. "Sheriff," called a new voice from the road. "I wouldn't be too hasty with that arrest." Everyone turned to see Ezra Morrison approaching on horseback, his legal satchel secured behind his saddle and his expression grim with purpose. Behind him rode Pastor McNeil, and in the old preacher's hands was a leather portfolio that looked thick with documents. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Dalton said with obvious relief, "what brings you out here?" "Legal complications," Morrison replied, dismounting with careful dignity. "It seems Mrs. Hawthorne's claims against Miss McKenna are more complex than they initially appeared." Mrs. Hawthorne's confident smile faltered slightly. "I don't know what you mean. The theft charges are clearly documented." "As is Miss McKenna's rightful inheritance," Morrison interrupted smoothly. "Pastor McNeil has brought some very interesting documents from his church archives. It seems Miss McKenna's mother, Sarah, left quite a detailed will with the church before she married and moved west." Pastor McNeil stepped forward, his weathered hands steady as he opened the portfolio. "Sarah McKenna, Lila's mother, deposited these documents with our church when she was 17, before she left home. She was pregnant, unmarried, and terrified, but she was also thinking clearly about her child's future." He withdrew a document that even from a distance looked official and carefully prepared. "This is Sarah's will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving everything she owned to my daughter, should she survive and come of age. That includes all the jewelry Mrs. Hawthorne claims was stolen items that belonged to Sarah's mother and grandmother, passed down through the female line." "That's impossible," Mrs. Hawthorne sputtered. "Those items belonged to William McKenna's family." "No, they didn't," Pastor McNeil said firmly. I have the documentation proving they were Sarah's personal property, brought into her marriage as her dowry. When she married William McKenna, the jewelry remained hers by right, and by this will, it belongs to her daughter." Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd found the perfect precedent. In other words, Sheriff, Miss McKenna can't be charged with stealing property that legally belongs to her. Mrs. Hawthorne's theft charges are without foundation. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Hawthorne's face had gone through several shades of red and was settling into a dangerous purple. Her hired men looked confused, uncertain whether they were still needed or if the legal ground had shifted beneath their feet. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Hawthorne said finally. "That will is 30 years old, filed by a frightened child. It has no legal standing." "Actually, it does," Morrison said cheerfully. "Pastor McNeil's church is recognized by territorial law as having the authority to hold such documents. The will is properly executed, properly witnessed, and never superseded by any later document. Miss McKenna is not only innocent of theft, she's technically the victim of theft, since Mrs. Hawthorne has been in possession of property that rightfully belonged to someone else." Colt watched this legal drama unfold with growing amazement. In the space of minutes, the trap that had seemed so carefully constructed had crumbled into dust. But even as relief flooded through him, he realized the deeper problem remained unsolved. Lila might be legally free, but she was still convinced that their love was somehow tainted by her parentage. The charges had dropped. Sheriff Dalton said, clearly grateful to escape a situation that had become too complicated for comfort. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I suggest you return those jewelry items to their rightful owner." "Like hell I will, Mrs." Hawthorne snarled, her mask of civility finally slipping completely. "That girl has caused me nothing but trouble and expense. She's going to pay for it one way or another." Her hand moved toward the gun holstered at her hip, and suddenly the legal victory felt meaningless. Colt saw the madness in her eyes, the desperate fury of someone whose careful plans had been destroyed, and he knew that Mrs. Hawthorne was past caring about law or consequences. "Everyone get down," he shouted, drawing his own weapon as Mrs. Hawthorne's gun cleared leather. But it was Lila who moved first, stepping between Colt and Mrs. Hawthorne with the fearless determination of someone who'd finally decided what was worth fighting for. "Enough," she said, her voice ringing across the yard with unexpected authority. "I'm tired of being your weapon against good people. I'm tired of letting your poison corrupt everything I touch. And I'm tired of running from who I am and who I choose to love." She turned to look at Colt, and for the first time in 3 days, her eyes held hope instead of despair. "You asked me once what I wanted them to think about us. I want them to think that love is stronger than blood, that choice matters more than circumstance, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we build rather than the ones we're born into." The words hit Colt like a lightning bolt, electrifying and transformative. In the middle of this armed confrontation, with guns drawn and tempers flaring, Lila had found her way back to the truth that mattered most. They had chosen each other, and that choice was more powerful than any accident of birth or twist of fate. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Lila continued, turning back to face her stepmother, "you've spent years trying to control me, own me, profit from me. But I'm not your property, and I never was. I'm Sarah McKenna's daughter, and I'm choosing to honor her memory by building the kind of life she would have wanted for me, only filled with love, respect, and genuine family." Mrs. Hawthorne's gun wavered in her grip, her face contorting with rage and frustration. Around the yard, her hired men began to look uncertain, as if wondering whether their pay was worth getting killed over a family dispute that had spiraled beyond all reason. "You little fool," Mrs. Hawthorne whispered. "You have no idea what you're giving up. Simpson would have made you rich, respectable." "He would have made me miserable," Lila replied firmly. "Just like you tried to make me miserable, but that ends now, today, here." She walked over to Colt and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as naturally as if they'd been doing it for decades. "I love this man, not because he loved my mother, but despite it. Not because fate threw us together, but because we chose to stay together when we could have walked away. And if he'll still have me, knowing everything we now know, I'd like to finish what we started 3 days ago." Colt looked down at her, face determined, beautiful, absolutely certain, and felt the last of his doubts crumble away. Jake had been right. Love didn't follow bloodlines or make sense on paper. It simply was, as real and undeniable as the sunrise, as necessary as breathing. "Miss McKenna," he said formally, his voice carrying across the yard so everyone could hear, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes, Mr. Avery," she replied with a smile that could have lit up the entire territory. "I believe I would." And as they stood there, hands joined and hearts committed, Mrs. Hawthorne's fury finally boiled over into the violence that had been building all along. "If I can't have her," she screamed, raising her gun toward Lila, "then no one can." But as her finger tightened on the trigger, Colt was already moving, his body blocking Lila's as gunfire erupted across the yard, and the final confrontation began in earnest. The gunshot cracked across the yard like thunder, and Colt felt the burn of the bullet as it grazed his shoulder. He stumbled but kept his feet, his body still shielding Lila as chaos erupted around them. Mrs. Hawthorne's hired men, startled by their employer's sudden violence, scrambled for cover or drew their own weapons, unsure whether they were supposed to be fighting or fleeing. "Get behind the water trough," Colt shouted to Lila, pushing her toward the nearest cover as he drew his Colt .45. The familiar weight of the weapon in his hand steadied him, muscle memory from younger, more dangerous days taking over. Jake had already found position behind the porch steps, his rifle trained on the cluster of hired guns. "Tom, Peter, get to the barn and cover the flanks," he called. "Don't let any of them circle around." Sheriff Dalton, caught between duty and common sense, had his own weapon drawn, but seemed paralyzed by the situation. "Mrs. Hawthorne, put down the gun. This has gone far enough." But Mrs. Hawthorne was past listening to reason. Years of careful planning had crumbled in a single afternoon, her control over Lila evaporating like morning mist. Her face was twisted with a rage that had moved beyond sanity into something primitive and dangerous. "She ruined everything, Mrs. Hawthorne screamed, firing another wild shot that splintered the porch railing inches from Colt's head. "That ungrateful little wretch destroyed my life, and now she thinks she can just walk away." "Your life was already destroyed," Lila called from behind the water trough, her voice carrying clearly despite the danger. "Destroyed by gambling and greed and the poison you carry in your heart. I didn't do that to you. You did it to yourself." The truth of those words seemed to enrage Mrs. Hawthorne even further. She swung her gun toward Lila's voice, but Colt was already moving, his own weapon speaking with deadly precision. The bullet took Mrs. Hawthorne in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her gun flying into the dust. For a moment, the yard fell silent, except for Mrs. Hawthorne's cries of pain and fury. Then one of her hired men, a scarred brute with cold eyes and no conscience, raised his rifle toward Colt. "Boss lady's paying us to bring the girl back," he growled. "Dead or alive," she said, "makes no difference to me." But before he could fire, Jake's rifle cracked from the porch, and the man dropped like a stone. "Anyone else want to earn their pay the hard way?" Jake called to the remaining gunmen. The answer came in the form of scattered gunfire as 3 of the hired men decided to honor their contract, despite the odds. Bullets whined off stone and wood as Colt dove for better cover, his shoulder burning where Mrs. Hawthorne's shot had creased him. From his position behind an overturned wagon, Colt could see Lila crouched behind the water trough, her face pale but determined. She wasn't cowering or weeping instead. She was looking around with the calculating gaze of someone planning her next move. "Stay down," he called to her, but even as he spoke, he saw her begin to crawl toward the barn where Tom and Pete had taken position. A gunman appeared around the corner of the bunkhouse, rifle raised, and aimed at Lila's moving form. Colt's blood turned to ice as he realized he couldn't get a clear shot from his position. Time seemed to slow as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Pastor McNeil stepped into view, moving with the fearless dignity of a man who'd spent 60 years facing down evil in all its forms. He carried no weapon except his Bible, but he placed himself directly between the gunman and Lila with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "Son," the old preacher said calmly, "I've presided over more funerals than I care to count. Men who died for money, for pride, for causes they didn't understand. Don't make me add your name to that list." The gunman hesitated, clearly unnerved by the old man's complete lack of fear. "Get out of the way, preacher. This ain't your fight." "Any fight over an innocent girl's freedom is my fight," Pastor McNeil replied, "just as it would be God's fight, if you believe in such things." While the gunman struggled with this unexpected moral challenge, Lila reached the barn safely. But the distraction had cost them. Another hired gun had circled around to flank Jake's position, and Colt saw the rifle barrel gleaming in the afternoon sun. Colt's service revolver spoke 3 times in rapid succession, the bullets walking up the barn wall to where the flanking gunman crouched. The man yelped and dove for cover, his own shot going wild and harmless. "How many more of them are there?" Tom called from inside the barn. "Too many," Jake replied grimly, "and they're getting organized." Indeed, the remaining gunmen seemed to be coordinating their movements, using hand signals and covering fire to advance on the ranch buildings. Mrs. Hawthorne, despite her wounded shoulder, was shouting orders from behind her own cover, her voice shrill with pain and determination. "Burn them out," she screamed. "Fire the buildings if you have to. I want that girl, and I want her now." The threat of fire changed everything. Colt could see one of the men pulling brands from his saddlebags, prepared for exactly this contingency. A ranch was built of wood and dreams, and both could be consumed by flames with terrifying speed. "We need to end this," Colt told Jake during a brief lull in the shooting, "before they torch everything we've built." "What do you have in mind?" Colt studied the positions of the remaining gunmen, counting rifles and calculating odds. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had creased it, but his gun hand was steady and his mind clear. 30 years ago, he'd been a soldier before he was a rancher, and those skills hadn't entirely faded. "I'm going to draw them out," he said. "Get them focused on me, so you and the boys can take them clean. That's suicide, and you know it." "Maybe, but it's also the only way to protect Lila and everyone else." Colt checked his ammunition, 4 shots left, plus a spare cylinder, if he could find time to reload. "When I make my move, you hit them hard and fast. Don't give them time to think or regroup." Before Jake could protest further, Colt was moving, vaulting over his cover and running in a zigzag pattern toward the center of the yard. He presented an irresistible target and immediately drew fire from multiple directions. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet as he dove and rolled, came up firing, and dove again. His first shot took down the man with the firebrands. His second wounded another gunman badly enough to put him out of the fight. But there were still too many, and they were closing in from multiple angles. Colt found himself pinned behind a hay wagon, with bullets chewing splinters from the wood, inches above his head. That's when he heard the sound of approaching horses, coming fast and in large numbers. Through the dust and gun smoke, he could see riders streaming down the road toward the ranch. For a terrifying moment, he thought Mrs. Hawthorne had brought reinforcements. Then he recognized the lead rider, Samuel Carlson, followed by his sons and half the men from the neighboring ranches. Word had spread somehow, probably through Doc Henderson, who must have ridden for help when the shooting started. Cavalry's arrived. Jake whooped from the porch, and suddenly the tactical situation reversed itself completely. The hired gunmen, faced with overwhelming odds, began to break and run. 2 threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. A third tried to reach his horse and was brought down by Samuel Carlson's rifle. The last man standing, the one who'd threatened Pastor McNeil, looked around wildly and then did the worst possible thing. He grabbed Mrs. Hawthorne and held his gun to her head. "Everyone back off," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I've got the boss lady, and I'll kill her if you don't let me ride out of here." The irony was almost too perfect. Mrs. Hawthorne, the architect of this violence, now held hostage by her own hired gun. But Colt felt no satisfaction, only a weary desire for the shooting to stop before anyone else got hurt. "Let her go," he called, stepping out from behind the wagon with his hands partially raised. "Take a horse and ride. No one will follow you." "You think I'm stupid," the gunman snarled. "Soon as I let her go, you'll put a bullet in my back." "No," Colt said quietly. "I give you my word as a rancher and a neighbor. Ride out, and this ends here." For a moment, it seemed like the standoff might resolve peacefully. Then Mrs. Hawthorne, even with a gun to her head, couldn't resist one final act of spite. "You'll never be happy," she hissed at Lila, who had emerged from the barn now that help had arrived. "Every time you look at him, you'll remember what you are. Every time he touches you, you'll wonder if he's thinking of her. I may not be able to stop you, but I can poison whatever you think you've found." The words were cruel and calculated, designed to plant seeds of doubt that would grow and fester over time. But Lila looked at Mrs. Hawthorne with something that might have been pity. "The only poison here is what you carry in your own heart," Lila replied, "and I refuse to let it infect mine." Then, with the quick reflexes of desperation, Mrs. Hawthorne elbowed her captor in the ribs and broke free, diving for the gun she'd dropped earlier. The hired gunman, startled by her sudden movement, swung his rifle toward her and walked directly into the sights of Colt's service revolver. The final shot of the battle echoed across the yard, and then there was only silence, smoke, and the settling dust of a confrontation that had tested everyone's courage and found it sufficient. Mrs. Hawthorne lay motionless in the dirt, her hand just inches from the gun she'd been reaching for. The hired gunman who'd held her hostage was down as well, brought low by his own greed and poor judgment. Sheriff Dalton emerged from cover, looking shaken, but determined to restore some semblance of law and order. "Is it over?" he asked. Colt looked around the yard at the wounded men being tended by neighbors, at the bullet holes in his buildings, at Lila standing safely in the midst of friends who'd risked their lives to protect her. His shoulder throbbed, his hands shook slightly from adrenaline, and he felt older than his 58 years. But when Lila's eyes met his across the devastation, he saw something that made all the pain worthwhile. Love, pure and uncompromised, no longer shadowed by doubt or twisted by the lies of cruel people. "Yes," he said to the sheriff, but his words were meant for Lila. "It's over." The aftermath of gunfire brought a strange, ringing silence to the ranch yard. Smoke drifted lazily from rifle barrels, while dust settled on overturned furniture and splintered wood. Colt stood among the debris of what had been, until an hour ago, a peaceful wedding morning, his service revolver still warm in his hand. Sheriff Dalton moved methodically through the scene, checking the fallen men and securing weapons. 2 of Mrs. Hawthorne's hired guns had survived with wounds that Doc Henderson was already tending. The others would need no medical attention ever again. Mrs. Hawthorne herself lay crumpled near the porch steps, her elaborate traveling dress now torn and stained with dust and blood. The woman who had orchestrated so much cruelty looked smaller in death, almost pitiful just, another casualty of her own poisonous ambitions. "Federal Marshal Garrett will want a full report when he arrives next week," Sheriff Dalton said, approaching Colt with obvious relief. "But from what I witnessed, this was clear self-defense. Mrs. Hawthorne fired first, threatened innocent lives, and her men opened fire on a lawful gathering." Colt nodded absently, his attention focused on Lila, who stood near the barn, surrounded by concerned neighbors. Martha Henderson was fussing over a small cut on Lila's arm, where a splinter had caught her during the gunfight. The older woman's maternal care was exactly what Lila needed, proof that she had found not just a man to love, but a community to embrace her. "More importantly," Sheriff Dalton continued, producing a badge from his vest pocket, "I have something that belongs to you." Colt looked at the federal marshal's badge with confusion. "I don't understand." "Marshal Garrett sent this ahead of his arrival. Seems he's been investigating Mrs. Hawthorne's operation for months, fraud, extortion, illegal gambling debts used to coerce young women into unwanted marriages. He was hoping to arrest her when he arrived, but..." Dalton gestured at the carnage around them. Sometimes justice takes care of itself. The badge felt heavy in Colt's hands, its weight representing not just law and order, but vindication. Everything they'd suspected about Mrs. Hawthorne's corruption had been true. Lila hadn't been her first victim, merely the latest in a string of young women whose lives had been bartered to pay gambling debts or settle scores. "The Marshal wants to offer you a position," Dalton explained. "Deputize you to help clean up this kind of operation throughout the territory. Seems you've proven you can handle yourself in a crisis." Colt looked at the badge, then at Lila, then back at the sheriff. "I'm honored by the offer, but I think my deputizing days are behind me. I've got a ranch to run and—" He paused, hope threading through his voice, possibly a wedding to finish. Dalton smiled, the first genuine expression Colt had seen from him all day. "Can't say I blame you. That's a fine woman you've got there, worth more than all the badges in the territory." As the sheriff moved away to continue his investigation, Colt felt a presence at his side. Pastor McNeil approached slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the violence he'd witnessed. "I owe you an apology," the old preacher said quietly. "I came here to deliver truth, but I nearly destroyed the very happiness that truth was meant to protect." "You did what you thought was right," Colt replied. "The rest of us had to figure out what to do with the information. Still, I should have found a gentler way. You're Sarah Lila's mother, she wouldn't have wanted her secrets to cause such pain." Pastor McNeil reached into his coat and withdrew one more document older than the others, written in a feminine hand that Colt recognized despite the years. "I saved this for last, hoping it wouldn't be needed, but after what I witnessed today, I think you both deserve to see it." Colt unfolded the paper carefully, recognizing Sarah's handwriting immediately. The letter was addressed simply, "For my daughter, should we ever meet." "My dearest child," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then God has answered my prayers in ways I dared not hope. I gave you life but could not give you a home. I gave you a way to save you from shame, but I have prayed every day that you would find the love and family you deserve. If you have found your way to Coltan somehow, in my heart, I believe you will then know that you have found the best of men. He loved me with a gentle strength that healed old wounds, and he will love you the same way if you let him. Do not fear that loving him dishonors my memory. Love is not a finite resource that diminishes when shared. The heart that loved me is large enough to love you too, completely and without reservation. I have seen enough of life to know that happiness is rare and precious. When you find it, child, hold it close. Do not let the opinions of small minds or the cruelties of bitter people convince you to throw away what God has given. Love where you are loved, and build the family that choice and commitment create. Your devoted mother, Sarah Elizabeth McKenna Avery." Colt read the letter twice, his eyes stinging with emotion. Even from beyond the grave, Sarah was trying to take care of them, to bless what others might curse, to build bridges where others saw only obstacles. "She wrote it the week before she died," Pastor McNeil explained softly. "Asked me to keep it with the other documents, said she had a feeling it might be needed someday. I thought she was rambling from the fever, but she knew," Colt finished. "Somehow she knew." When he looked up, Lila was walking toward them, having escaped Martha Henderson's determined nursing. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, but her eyes were bright, with something that looked remarkably like joy. "Is that from her?" Lila asked, nodding toward the letter in Colt's hands. "Yes, from your mother, our Sarah." He handed her the letter, watching as she read the words that would either free them or bind them to the past forever. When she finished, Lila folded the letter carefully and looked up at Colt with wonder. She knew, she actually knew this might happen. Seems that way. And she gives us her blessing, her permission to love each other without guilt or shame. Lila's voice grew stronger with each word. After everything we've been through, after all the doubt and fear and confusion, she gives us permission to be happy. Colt felt something shift inside his chestnut, the crack of ice breaking, but the warm expansion of a heart learning to hope again. Permission we probably should have given ourselves from the beginning. Probably. But sometimes we need to hear it from the people we love most. Lila looked around the damaged yard, at the neighbors cleaning up debris and tending wounded men, at the evidence of violence overcome by community and love. She would have liked this, wouldn't she? All these people coming together to protect what matters. She would have loved it, Colt confirmed, and she would have loved you not as an echo of herself, but as the remarkable woman you've become. Pastor Williams approached them tentatively, his wedding Bible still clutched in his hands, despite the morning's chaos. "If you're still interested," he said carefully, "I believe we have some unfinished business." Lila looked at Colt, her eyes questioning and hopeful. "Are you sure? After everything that's happened, everything we've learned?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Colt replied, taking her hands in his. "We've been tested by fire and found worthy. We've been blessed by the past and freed to build the future. If you'll still have me, I'd like to finish what we started." "Yes," Lila said, her smile radiant, despite the destruction around them. "Yes, I'll have you. All of you, your past, your grief, your love for her, and your love for me. I'll take it all and give you everything I am in return." As Pastor Williams opened his Bible and the surviving neighbors gathered around them, Colt felt the weight of Mrs. Hawthorne's malice lifting from his shoulders. The federal marshal's badge in his pocket represented justice served, but it was nothing compared to the justice of love triumphing over hatred, of two wounded hearts finding healing in each other. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of hammering as someone began repairing bullet holes in the barn wall. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and this community to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony proceeded without further interruption, surrounded by the evidence of violence overcome and community triumphant. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered neighbors cheered with the enthusiasm of people who had fought for this happiness and earned the right to celebrate it. As Colt kissed his bride for the first time as married people, he felt Sarah's presence not as a barrier between them, but as a blessing upon them. The past had been honored, the present secured, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story full of possibility. The ranch would be rebuilt, stronger than before. The community would remember this day as the moment when good people stood together against evil and won. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled with the promise of rain, the kind of gentle, soaking rain that would help new things grow in ground that had been watered with tears and sanctified by love. 6 months had passed since the day gunfire shattered the morning quiet at Amber Creek Ranch, and autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The bullet holes had been patched, the broken fence rails replaced, and new paint gleamed white on the ranch house porch. But the most significant changes weren't visible in wood and stone. They lived in the laughter that echoed from the kitchen windows and the sense of completeness that had settled over the land like a gentle blessing. Colt stood in the doorway of the barn, watching his wife tend to the orphaned calf they'd found wandering the south pasture 3 weeks ago. Lila knelt in the straw, bottle-feeding the little Hereford with the same patient tenderness she brought to everything under her care. Her voice carried softly through the afternoon air as she spoke to the calf in the gentle, encouraging tones that had become the soundtrack of their rebuilt life. "There you go, little one," she murmured, stroking the calf's red and white coat. "Soon you'll be strong enough to run with the herd, but for now you just focus on growing big and healthy." Marriage had changed them both in ways that continued to surprise Colt. Lila had blossomed from the frightened girl he'd rescued in the storm into a confident woman who moved through the world with quiet authority. She'd taken over management of the household accounts, organized the ranch hands' work schedules with efficiency that impressed even Jake, and somehow found time to tend a garden that now supplied vegetables to 3 neighboring families. But it was the smaller changes that moved Colt most deeply. The way she hummed while cooking breakfast, filling the kitchen with melodies that chased away years of solitary silence. How she'd rearranged the furniture in the parlor to encourage conversation rather than brooding. The fresh flowers that appeared regularly on Sarah's grave, placed there not out of obligation but from genuine respect for the woman who'd made their love possible. "Mr. Avery," called a voice from the yard, interrupting his reverie. Colt turned to see young Timothy Henderson approaching on horseback, the boy's face bright with the importance of his errand. "Pa sent me to tell you that Pastor Williams got word from town. There's a family coming through on the wagon train got, 3 children, and nowhere to go. He was wondering if you might have room for them through the winter." Colt looked at Lila, who had emerged from the calf stall with hay in her hair and a smile that lit up her entire face. They'd discussed this possibility many times over the past months. Their house felt too large for just 2 people, their hearts too full not to share what they'd been given. "How old are the children?" Lila asked, already moving toward the barn door, with the eager steps of someone who'd found her calling. "Boy about 12, girl maybe 8, and a little one still in diapers," Timothy replied. "Their folks died of fever crossing the plains. Wagon master says they're good kids, just need someone to care for them proper." Lila and Colt exchanged a look that held an entire conversation. They'd talked about children of their own, but at their ages, such hopes were more dream than expectation. This felt like Providence offering them a different path to the family they both yearned for. "Tell Pastor Williams we'll take them," Colt said, his decision surprising him with its immediacy. "All 3 of them, for as long as they need a home." "Yes, sir." Timothy wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward town, eager to share the good news. As the dust settled behind the boy's departure, Lila moved to stand beside Colt, her hand finding his with the natural ease of 6 months' practice. "Are you sure?" she asked, though her eyes were already bright with anticipation. 3 children will change everything about how we live." "Everything's already changed," Colt replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "When I rescued a bride in a wedding dress from that storm, I thought I was just helping someone in trouble. I had no idea I was saving my own life in the process." They walked together toward the house, their steps matching in the unconscious rhythm of people who'd learned to move through life as partners. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood trees that Sarah had planted 30 years ago, their golden leaves creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Inside the house, evidence of their shared life filled every room. Lila's sewing basket sat beside the window where she spent evenings mending and creating, while Colt's books shared shelf space with the volumes of poetry she'd brought from her mother's modest collection. The kitchen held the rich sense of bread baking and stew simmering preparations for a dinner that would include Jake, Doc Henderson, and Pastor Williams, who'd begun joining them for weekly meals. On the mantelpiece, Sarah's wooden cross stood beside a new addition, a small silver frame holding the daguerreotype Pastor McNeil had given them of Sarah as a young woman. But it was placed not as a shrine to the past, but as a bridge between then and now, honoring memory while embracing the future. "I've been thinking," Lila said, as they settled into their chairs by the fireplace, "about names." "Names?" "For the children. If they're going to be part of our family, they should have the choice of our name too. McKenna Avery, perhaps, so they keep their parents' memory but gain our protection." Colt felt his chest tighten with emotion. 6 months ago, he'd been a man alone, convinced his capacity for love had been buried with his first wife. Now he was contemplating raising 3 orphan children with a woman who saw possibility where others might see only burden. "You're remarkable, you know that," he said, studying her face in the firelight. "The way you embrace life, embrace challenges, embrace people who need homes and hope." "I learned it from you," Lila replied, settling back in her chair with the contented grace of someone who'd found her place in the world. "From a man who opened his home to a stranger in a storm, who fought impossible odds to protect someone he barely knew, who chose love over fear, even when the whole world seemed determined to tear us apart." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. But inside the house, warmth and light held the darkness at bay. On the kitchen table, Lila's latest project waited new wedding rings she was having made to replace the simple bands they'd exchanged during their hurried ceremony. The local silversmith was crafting them from silver that had belonged to both their families, melting down old jewelry to create something entirely new. "Do you ever regret it?" Lila asked suddenly, her voice soft with vulnerability that still surfaced sometimes. "Taking on all my complications, all the trouble that came with loving me." Colt left his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her hands in his weathered ones. Even after 6 months of marriage, touching her still felt like a small miracle, this beautiful, vibrant woman who'd chosen to build a life with a grizzled rancher old enough to be her father. "Never," he said firmly, "not for a single moment. You brought life back to this place, brought laughter back to my days, brought purpose back to my heart. If I had to fight Mrs. Hawthorne and her hired guns every week for the rest of my life, it would still be worth it. Even knowing what you know now, about my mother, about the strange twists of fate that brought us together, especially knowing that." Colt's voice grew warm with conviction. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for the one person who completes them. I was lucky enough to find that person twice, first with your mother, who taught me how to love, and then with you, who taught me how to love again. Different loves, but both precious, both real, both worth everything I had to give." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you, Colt Avery. I love your past and your present, and whatever future we're going to build together. I love that we're about to become a family of 5, and I love that this old house is going to be full of children's voices again." "I love you too, Lila Grace Avery," Colt replied, using her married name with the satisfaction of a man who'd fought for the right to claim her. "And I love that we're proof that some stories have happy endings, even when they start with storms and sorrow." As if summoned by their words, the sound of wagon wheels on the road drew their attention to the window. Through the gathering dusk, they could see Pastor Williams approaching with a wagon, carrying 3 small silhouettes huddled together under traveling blankets. "Our children," Lila whispered, rising to peer out the window. "Our family," Colt agreed, standing beside her as they watched their future arriving in the form of 3 orphaned souls who needed exactly what they had to offer: a home, protection, and love without conditions. Together, they walked to the porch to greet the latest additions to the Amber Creek Ranch family. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and possibility, of harvest gathered and new seeds planted. In the distance, cattle lowed their evening songs while horses nickered their welcome to the approaching wagon. As the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, Colt felt Sarah's presence one last timino as a barrier between past and future, but as a bridge spanning the years. She'd loved him, taught him how to build a home and family, then sent him her daughter when he was ready to love again. It was the kind of circle that made sense only in looking back, the kind of grace that made believers out of skeptics. The children climbed down from the wagon with the careful dignity of people who'd learned not to expect too much from adults. But when Lila knelt to their level and spoke in the gentle voice that had calmed frightened animals and healed wounded hearts, their caution began to melt into hope. "Welcome home," she said simply. And in those 2 words, Colt heard the echo of everything they'd fought for and want the right to choose their own family, to build their own happiness, to prove that love could triumph over any obstacle when people were brave enough to fight for what mattered most. Standing on his porch, watching his wife embrace 3 children who would soon call them mother and father, Colt Avery understood that miracles didn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes they grew quiet and steady, the way dawn tiptoed across the mesa, transforming darkness into light, one gentle moment at a time. The storm that had brought Lila to his door seemed like a lifetime ago, but its gift continued to unfold in ways he was still discovering. Tonight, they would sit around the dinner table as a family of 5. Tomorrow, they would begin the patient work of healing young hearts and building new dreams. And someday, when these children were grown and gone to lives of their own, the story would be told of how a rich cowboy saved a bride left by a cruel stepmother. Unaware, she would become his everyday miracle that multiplied and spread until it encompassed everyone, blessed enough to find shelter under the wide Wyoming sky of the Amber Creek Ranch.